A wealthy traveler once joined a around-the-world group tour, and while in Korea, the man observed a boy in a field pulling a rude plow. The wealthy traveler noticed that there was an older man behind the boy holding the plow handles in order to direct it. He was amused by the scene and took a picture and turned to his guide and said, "That is a curious picture. I suppose they must be very poor." The guide replied, "When a church was being built, the family was eager to give something, but they had no money. So they sold their ox and gave the money to the church. This season, they must pull the plow themselves." The wealthy man said, "Wow, that must have been a real sacrifice." The guide smiled and replied, "It's funny that you think of it that way because they did not. They thought that they were very fortunate that they had an ox that they could sell." I think that story illustrates two very different ways that we can approach our relationship with God. One way, out of a sense of obligation. We attend worship. We give a pledge or offering. We serve on a committee or we teach Sunday school because we think we should. And before too long, it begins to feel like a real sacrifice. Especially if the football game that we want to watch is coinciding with worship that day, or if we must put off buying a new car because we decided to increase our giving to the church. The other way to approach our relationship with God is out of a sense of anticipation and privilege. We might feel fortunate for the chance to stop all of our daily busyness to draw near to God in worship. We might even feel a sense of liberation when we give an offering because it means that we're not acquiring one more thing that we just don't need. This is week 5 in a 6-week series called Rooted, where we are exploring our Methodist origins, our history and heritage and values. We will conclude the series next Sunday exploring maybe the way ahead, but I have appreciated the feedback I've gotten throughout this series. I was talking to someone who said, when you announced the series, I thought it was going to be really boring. And they appreciated what they were learning. And then there are some Methodists who said, "I just never knew that." And I'm glad that I know that. I do belong in a Methodist church. Over the past 2 weeks, we have been exploring Methodism's 3 general rules. Our founder, John Wesley, developed these 3 rules for those who wanted to be faithful to the teachings, to the way of Jesus. And he called this practical divinity. Putting divinity into practice here and now. The first 2 rules, as we heard, are do no harm and do good. The third rule, stay in love with God. In his book, 3 Simple Rules, A Wesleyan Way of Living, Bishop Reuben Job says that the first 2 rules are really impossible unless we are concentrating our energy on the third. It is, he says, a loving relationship towards God that enlivens us, sustains us, calls us, and shapes us, making it possible for us to truly avoid doing harm and to truly do good. And it is a growing love of God that saves these rules from becoming drudgery, a perfunctory duty, a real sacrifice. Now, John Wesley learned this from experience. As I've shared, Wesley was an Anglican minister in the 1700s. He was the son of a clergyman and a devout Christian mother. And all his life, from childhood on, he tried to be a faithful Christian. He read his Bible and he prayed daily. He attended worship and he received the sacraments regularly. He made sure not only to give to the church, but to widows and to orphans. And for the first 31 years of his life, Wesley did these things as a matter of duty. It was a real sacrifice. That changed in 1738. Well, at a prayer meeting, Wesley said that he felt his heart strangely warmed, and that he really knew for the first time in his life that God really did love him. After this night, Wesley still read the Bible and prayed daily. He attended worship and took the sacraments regularly. He visited prisons and he still gave money for various ministries. But his motivation had changed. In his own words, before Wesley's heart was strangely warmed, he said, "I had the faith of a servant," which is not bad. But afterwards, he said, and for the rest of his life, "I had the faith of a son." No longer did Wesley do good out of a sense of duty. He did it because he loved God and he wanted to stay in love with God. He was motivated by feelings of affection and privilege, which is why Wesley later observed that sour godliness is the devil's religion. Sour godliness is the devil's religion. Can you think of people who have a sour godliness? Stay in love with God. According to Jesus, there's nothing more important. The three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all record that when he is asked to name the greatest commandment, that Jesus cites Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And then Jesus added these words from Leviticus 19:18, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The Old Testament book of Exodus tells us when God liberated the Hebrew slaves from out of Egypt, they arrived eventually at Mount Sinai. And eventually, Moses went up the hill, the mountain, to commune with God, and he came down with the 10 commandments. The first being, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, we don't tend to think of it this way, but that Sinai moment was something of a marriage covenant between God and the Jewish people. A coming together of the divine and the human in relationship. And the first commandment was about having no other relationship, no other love interest that comes between that marriage commitment between God and the Hebrew people. For better or for worse, the Bible is nothing if not honest. See what I did there? And it tells us again and again about the fickleness of those who say they love God, who take vows of commitment, but who are nonetheless distracted by other lesser gods. In our culture, we are daily invited to fall in love with power, with success, with wealth, with lust, with nationalism and accumulation, the quest for personal security. And then we wonder why our relationship with God is not all that vital and life-giving. Could it be that we are not stoking the flames of our relationship with God? John Wesley's words for staying in love with God, his word for that was ordinance. Wesley said we could stay in love with God by attending upon all the ordinances of God. Now, ordinance is kind of a strange word to our ears. It's what city councils pass. But it's a word that Wesley used to describe practices that keep our relationship, the relationship between God and humans, vital and growing. And Wesley said that there were several practices that were key, several ordinances that were key. Public worship of God, the Lord's Supper, private and family prayer, Bible study, and fasting. If we are to stay in love with God, we must have a plan, a method for nurturing our relationship with God. Just as in romantic relationships, where we fall in love with that special someone, it is not long before we learn that staying in love requires some effort. Or is that just me? Each of us must find practices, both communal and private, to help us stay in love with God. Over the last 2,000 years, the cloud of witnesses that have gone before us have found that weekly worship, daily prayer, devotional Bible reading, sharing the Lord's table, and tithing are those practices by which we can nourish our love of God, not as a sacrifice, but as a privilege. I think the challenge is that many of us just don't want to put that much effort into this relationship. We prefer that it's God who makes all the effort. So when the preacher says, friends, see if you can begin to worship weekly. And I spelled out W-E-E-K-L-Y, not W-E-A-K-L-Y. Or see if you can grow towards the practice of tithing. Well, we hear that as arm twisting. But what it really is an invitation to step into a more fruitful and fulfilling relationship with God. Think of that as relationship counseling. As Hebrews 12:11 says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained in it. The early Methodists were onto this, and this is why Methodism spread like wildfire, both in England and across the pond here in the Americas. Someone has written, "This is the first, wildest, and wisest thing I know, that the soul exists and that it is built entirely out of attentiveness." That is why we attend upon all the ordinances of God, the practices that help us stay and grow in love of God. Because when we do, we discover that our soul is nourished and enlarged, and we discover that centering our life on God is not a real sacrifice. It's a privilege. It's a gift. It's a loving gift of God. And not for God's benefit, but for ours. Amen.